Good morning, everyone. Happy Thanksgiving weekend. Thank you, choir. You guys are just so thankful this morning. For everyone else, I guess we need a little dose of gratitude, right? So we get to talk about. So this week is the last week in our 8-week sermon series where we've been talking about what it means to be a disciple of Jesus, what it means to be sharing in Christ's mission of grace for God's world. And it just so happened that when we laid out all of the weeks for this series, that this week on gratitude, being grateful for God's daily provision, fell on that week of Thanksgiving. So Thanksgiving, just like any other holiday, we can be wrapped up in all the food and the details and the travel and all of that. But at least at its heart, Thanksgiving has this time where our culture acknowledges the benefit of being thankful. We may not be good at it. We may not be good as a culture at practicing gratitude, but at least we notice this week that it's good to be grateful for all the blessings that we have. And we certainly, especially in the United States, especially in this room, we have all been greatly blessed. There's a lot to be thankful for. But while we have this ritual as a culture of gratitude every year, I think the idea of being grateful for God's provision is deeply countercultural. And I don't mean about being religious or not. Believing in God, that's not necessarily countercultural. But believing that it's God's provision and not ours that counts. That's the thing that's radical, that we could use that message today. So lately, Caitlin and I have been competitive cooking show junkies. And if you don't know what that is, there's this whole world out there for you. There are millions of shows by now. And the idea of these competitive cooking shows is they're for people who like a little bit of competition, but we would much rather fantasize about eating than running or exercising. So if you're into that, maybe just turn on the Food Network any time of the day and you'll find Chopped or some other show. So we've been watching Halloween Wars, Holiday Baking Wars, Christmas Cookie Showdown, Chopped. Isn't that great? Christmas Cookie Showdown. It's so exciting. Chopped, Iron Chef, all of those shows, we've been watching a lot of those lately. But I started to notice that at the end of each of these shows, the winner for each week gets a few seconds in front of the camera, and they say a little bit of a victory speech of how they're feeling. And as I've been watching all of these shows, I've started to notice that there's a common theme, that many of these competitors say almost exactly the same victory speech. So it goes something like this. I'm so excited to be a Chopped champion or a holiday baking champion, and I just want to show by winning everyone who's watching that when you work hard for what you believe in, you can achieve anything. When you work hard for what you truly believe in, you can achieve anything. I think this sentiment is worth paying attention to. Now, the first thing that's going on is that these are chefs. And for anyone who pursues a career as a chef, just like as a musician or another artist, it can be hard to make a stable living in those fields. So you receive a lot of discouragement along the way when you're pursuing that passion. People will tell you, that's a nice hobby, but why don't you get a real job to pay the bills? So of course, when these chefs who've been pursuing their passion, who've received some kind of success and validation, when they get a chance to speak on television, they take that chance to tell people like them who are in their shoes, you don't have to give up just because you've been discouraged. And that's a good message. That message of hope and encouragement is important for us. But there's also a downside to it. On the flip side of that, this shows us this larger cultural narrative that tells us we earn whatever we get. We earn whatever we get in life, for good or for ill. So if you want success in life, all you have to do is work hard. If you're not getting it, push yourself harder and harder and harder until you get it. And if you're not succeeding, if you have broken or lost relationships, if you don't have enough money, if you're poor, any of those things, you have no one to blame but yourself, because you earn your place in life. The people at the bottom, just like the people at the top. We earn what we have. So in this American myth of prosperity, we provide for ourselves. We have to pick ourselves up from our own bootstraps. We have to provide for our families and ourselves and let everyone else worry about themselves because there may not be enough to go around. There may not be enough success and resources to go around, and there are just winners and losers in life, so make sure you are a winner and let everyone else worry about themselves. Do you see how this American myth of prosperity in reality is a myth of scarcity? Because we're afraid that there's not enough to go around. So we grab what we can and we hold on to it because we just want to make sure that we have ours, that we have earned success or achievement in life. We believe in that myth of scarcity as the gap between the rich and the poor in our country and around the world continues to grow wider. We believe in that myth of scarcity, and it shuts down important conversations and work that we could be doing to make sure that every person on the planet has access to their basic needs: food, water, medical care, education, all of that stuff, because we're afraid there's not enough to go around. But God's story has always been one of abundance and not of scarcity. In Genesis, God creates the world and everything in it, all of the resources, and God makes enough to go around. God provides enough for us. And then in that reading today, in the Lord's Prayer that we're so familiar with, we hear it time and time again, there's that one line where Jesus says to pray to God to give us today our daily bread. Now, every time you see an us or an our in the Lord's Prayer, I think of it like we're not just praying for the people in this room, we're praying on behalf of the world. Us and our is for everyone. So Jesus tells us to pray to God, give everyone our daily bread, our basic needs. Because Jesus trusts in God's provision. Jesus trusts that God has made enough to go around. So if you find yourself believing in that myth of scarcity and trying to hold on to whatever you can and letting everyone else worry about themselves, let go of what wasn't yours in the first place. Let go of what wasn't yours in the first place. And let's figure out how we can make sure every person gets enough. Because it's God who provides, and God has made enough to go around. Which takes us to the year of Jubilee. But before we can talk about Jubilee, we have to start with the Sabbath. A lot of people don't know about Jubilee, don't know what that means, but we know what the Sabbath is. It's one of the 10 Commandments, right? Where God says, thou shalt attendeth worship once a week for an hour and attendeth education hour if thou hast time, or something like that. At least that's how many churches are kind of guilty of talking about the Sabbath. But the Sabbath is primarily this command to rest. It comes after the people of Israel were slaves in Egypt, and they were made to work nonstop. Pharaoh made them and all their taskmasters, the managers over them, work more and more to make more bricks. And so their lives became just about production. Make more bricks. You're tired? Well, guess what? Make more bricks. And when they started to complain that there was too much expected of them, Pharaoh said, that's because you're being lazy. So I'm going to take away some of what you have, and you're going to still make more bricks. And this greed of Pharaoh, it's tied to that myth of scarcity. Of course, he can't afford to slow down production, let alone let people have time off. Because then he and his nation might miss out on the wealth that should be rightfully theirs for the taking. But then finally, the people of Israel, they're freed from this oppressive system, they're freed from Pharaoh, and God wants to make sure they don't get stuck in that same trap. So God says, people, you have to rest. Once a full day every 7 days, you have to rest. And not just you, everyone in your household. Your family, the people that work for you, the slaves, the resident aliens, which is another way of saying the immigrants in your community, the animals. Everyone has to rest. Everyone has to observe that Sabbath. But in order to practice that kind of Sabbath, especially in an agricultural society, you had to trust that God will provide enough for you in those 6 days that you can take that 7th day off. It was about rest, but it's also about trusting in God's provision. But that idea of Sabbath goes further. Not just every 7 days, but every 7 years. In that reading that we had today, this is what God says, Leviticus 25, verse 3, 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard, and gather in their yield. But in the 7th year shall be a Sabbath of complete rest for the land. Even the land has to rest. And for us nowadays, we know there are important agricultural reasons to do this, that it gives the soil time to replenish its nutrients. But thousands of years ago, they just had to trust that the land, that God would provide enough for them in the 6 years that they could rest on that 7th. So every 7 days, the people and the animals have to rest. Every 7 years, the land itself has to rest. But then every 7 times 7 years, a sort of super Sabbath, a Sabbath of Sabbaths, after those 49 years, in the 50th year, God implements this year of Jubilee. And here's what God says about that in verse 10. And you shall hallow the 50th year, and you shall proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. What that means? All the slaves were to be set free. On the year of Jubilee, every slave was to be set free. Now, in this time period, it was a common practice that if you would get into some kind of debt that you had no way of paying off, then you would sell yourself or be sold into slavery. But of course, it's not just you would sell your family into slavery. So then your children and their children would all become slaves. But then God says, on this year of Jubilee, all of that stops. All of the slaves, it doesn't matter why they're slaves, all of the slaves are set free. And then it continues, still in verse 10, it shall be a jubilee for you. You shall return, every one of you, to your property, and every one of you to your family. You shall return to your property. What that means is that every piece of land, every resource that was sold in some time of desperation is to be returned in that Jubilee year. And every debt is erased. Could you imagine that? All the slaves are set free, but then every resource, every piece of land that was sold is returned, and every debt is canceled in this year of Jubilee. And then it continues. God says in verse 23, the land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. In perpetuity, in other words, the land will not be sold permanently. It will not be sold continually. For the land is mine. With me, you are but aliens and tenants. The land, which is another way of saying our resources, everything that we have, everything that we've been entrusted to steward, all of that is God's, not ours. We are but aliens. We are but tenants taking care of it. All that we have is God's. That means everything that you have worked hard for years, or everything that has fallen into your laps, all of it is God's, not ours. And then this reading finishes, throughout the land that you hold, with all the resources that you have, you shall provide for the redemption of the land. Now, why did God implement this? Why did all the slaves need to be set free and the debts be canceled and the land returned? Because God knows, just as we know, then and today, that people fall on hard times, that people get unlucky, or they're taken advantage of, or they make bad decisions, and they find themselves stuck. They find themselves often struggling to survive with no way up. And it's not just them, but it's their children and their children's children that are stuck in that position, whatever the reason. And so in this year of Jubilee, God says all of that starts over. Because God has provided for us. All of it, the land, the resources, all of it's God's anyway. And there's enough to go around. So what does it mean to provide for the redemption of the land? For the people of Israel, this command of Jubilee meant to set the captives free, to release those debts, to return whatever land and resources were bought and sold and acquired, to make sure that everyone gets enough. The difficult question for us today is, what does it mean for us to provide for the world and its resources to be redeemed, to provide for the redemption of the land today? And I don't know. Maybe that's a sermon for the lead pastor to answer that question. Maybe next week he'll tell you, I don't know what the answer is. But I know that it starts with being grateful for what God has provided for us. That when we start to practice thanksgiving, when we start to practice looking around at all the ways that God has blessed us in abundance, we don't have to be stuck in that myth of scarcity. That we have to provide everything for ourselves and let everyone else worry about themselves. Because God has given us everything we have, and it's enough. Let's figure out how to make that work and how to redeem the world. So may you, may I, may all of us see the ways that we have been blessed and be grateful so that we can be a part of God's redemption in this world. Amen.